In this lesson for UEFN, we're going to be covering devices and interactions, and we're going to look at how we can get players to interact with a trigger to trigger an event. It's the most basic form of interactions that we could have in UEFN, but it allows us to explore the really complicated way that UEFN works. I don't mean complicated, I mean backwards way that UEFN works. Now, the first thing I'm just going to point out is that I have started a session because it takes a little while to load. I hit launch session, and it opens up a second window, which I have here. And you'll see that it's been spawning loads of guards for me because I specified guards. So here's our NPC. Not doing anything at the moment. It's just a little bit of a loose animation. And our guards aren't really programmed to do anything at all. They're just sort of walking around within the area that we told them they could patrol in. So that's all that's happened so far. Now, we need this open because if you want to test things, we're going to need players to test with. So this is where the interaction comes in. I'm going to Alt-Tab back to my Unreal project. You don't have to listen to it. Now, there's a new button up here. That wasn't there before. It's next to Game in Progress. Important to know, game is in progress. I've launched this locally, not remotely. Endgame will stop the game, but won't disconnect the session. There's a difference there. But the push changes is useful. If you want to make an update, you can push changes and you'll see it, not instantly, but you'll see it very quickly in the level without having to relaunch it. This is different to checking in changes, which is your revision control. It's very important to think that one of these is checking in to your team or the files that you're working on in the editor. And push changes is a different version of call it source control that pushes your changes up to your test level so you can play it. There is a bit distinction between the two. Okay, so I'm going to leave this running for now because it helps me. I will turn off my guard spawner because that will become annoying later. And I am going to start off by building a little trigger. And I'm going to put it in here next to fish sticks. In fact, I'm going to put it in front of fish sticks so I know where to find it later. In my content level, I am going, content browser, I'm going to go to Fortnite. And in devices, I have gameplay. I've done it again. I come to gameplay when I don't mean gameplay. I'm looking for the trigger, so I'm just going to search for it. Let's see where it is. Trigger. We want this trigger here. There's different types of trigger. There's triggers that detect that you've walked nearby. There's laser triggers, pulse triggers, but the trigger is just the generic, I've walked on it, please do something. And this is the equivalent in Unreal of having a sphere without a rigid body or a collision, but with a collision attached to it, which is programmed to trigger an event when something is detected passing through it. So this is designed to detect either a player or a guard or an NPC. Okay, and it looks like a trigger. Now we can turn this off so we don't have to see it. It is in here somewhere. It's visible in game. There we go. So we turn that off and then you won't see it when we actually load the game. It can be programmed to do loads of different things in loads of different ways. So we can specify that only one team has access to it or a class. So we can specify that that's a particular type of character. Maybe you have classes within your game, depending on how you built it, different levels, or maybe that's how you separate guards from players. And maybe those classes can activate it, like you could trigger a trap, for instance. So all those things are changeable. And, you can get really detailed here, like trigger it by water. Water lands on it, it triggers an event. Triggered by vehicles, something drives over it. You could drop something on it. And as it does things, does it trigger VFX and sound effects? Usually quite nice if it does. But if it doesn't fit with your style, you can change it. Now, these things here look like, in the most logical way that you'd expect a game to work, that if somebody stands on the trigger, you would say here, trigger does this thing. It's not that way around, it's the other way around. We find the object and we specify what... We specify on the object that in order for that object to play or to activate, it has to have seen this device and be triggered by it. So ignore, enable, disable, reset, times triggered, and trigger. These are ways of triggering it from another device. So you think about the tree of interactions here. we could have another trigger that triggers this one, and we would set this in here. So I can add here a device such as, and I've already got the trigger. I can specify that this is the same trigger is going to loop, but I can specify that that will trigger when another device is triggered, and that trigger will activate whatever is downstream of this. And so I've got a loop there as well that's appeared there. It'll make more sense as we go through this. So next we're going to create something else. Let's have a look at our VFX. Where are they?
Okay.
Not seeing it. Try an item. No. I'm still in devices. I need to go back to VFX in Fortnite. So here we go. We've got a load of stuff here. We've got particles and we've got VFX. So I'm just going to bring in a gas explosion. Okay. Now that's just going to play because it's designed to play when it's auto activated. So I'm going to untick this and now go down. No, that wrong. So I'll tell you what I'm going to do. I'm going to do something with fish sticks. So the trigger is going to trigger fish sticks because that's already in the level that makes things a little bit simpler. So we've got fish sticks here. Fish sticks, we said earlier, has all of these controls here. So enable, disable, despawn. So what we're going to despawn him when somebody walks on the trigger. So if we click on despawn to create an array element, it's now saying, right, so what is going to create the despawning? What is the interaction that's going to cause this to happen? So we need a device. The device will be our trigger. So that's this trigger here. So we now said you will despawn when something happens on this trigger. What is going to happen on this trigger? On triggered. There's only one option. That's quite simple, really, because it's a trigger and it does one thing, but some things do more complicated things, which we'll get to later. So it'll be despawned on trigger. Let's see if that works now. So we are going to push the changes, and it will take a little while because what I have to do is stop the game and then update. 15 changes have been made to this level. So we're going to save. See, session's still connected. And actually, if I just demonstrate to you what happens now, we're now in the Fortnite creative version of the environment. So we can actually make changes in here using Fortnite Creative. So we have access to our to the trigger. There's a way of accessing it, but I never use the system, so I don't really know. But you notice that it says edit mode preparing on the top left. That's because it is pushing. So we've got session updating on my UEFN editor, and then the edit mode is saying edit mode preparing. And this is just what happens when you want to test one little change. You have to do this every single time, which is why I'd recommend having the Fortnite window running on a PlayStation or another device so that you can continue to work in editor whilst this is happening on another screen. You could still do it on your computer. It's just moving the computing power around a bit and keeping things running lean. So I'm going to pause this while we wait for it to start. Okay, and we have started. And see, now we no longer have our guards. Guards are gone because I got rid of that. We can see our NPC. He's not doing anything at the moment, but our trigger is sitting there. So in theory, something's happened when we step on this trigger. There we go. So we created a trigger that despawned him. And because we've got his settings set up so that he automatically respawns, he's reappeared. Oh, we could keep doing this. Poor fish stick. Let's keep doing that over and over again. And of course, if we get back on it, before he's reappeared, the trigger won't actually do anything. We've triggered it before he had spawned, so there's nothing to despawn. Now, you did notice that the trigger did do something. It had an interaction. If I go back and do it again, you can see the trigger was reacting. That's the VFX and the sound effects, but it happened at the same time that the NPC was being spawned. So there we go. So that's a very simple interaction. Let's go back out of this and let's look at something a little bit more complicated now. Jump over to my editor. Now, the parts of this UEFN environment which start to get a little bit more clever, particularly when we have things like triggers, is controlling things like score and the experience system. So let's just have a go at adding experience in the first instance. So we're going to add a thing called an accolade. We have to search for this. And we could also, just to make it more obvious what's happening, we can also add an end game device, which will simulate the end of the system. So it will say, victory or loss or whatever it is that's happened. Now, you notice that these devices are starting to get an impression here that they're all set up kind of as objects. Okay, so they've got sort of a bit of movement to them and things. This is all part of the original Fortnite creative mode where everything has to be built as an object. So it's not really set up the way that an Unreal Engine game would be. What I would suggest you do is that you actually build in your level a place for all of these to go, because 000 is probably going to be the middle of your map. It's not that convenient. So pick a location, a number that's in a logical place somewhere outside the main play area. Put it inside a black box or room so people can't see it accidentally. Even though you can't actually see these, you can turn these off so that you can't see the bodies of them. But just keep them all in one place that's easy to find and order them logically. Have all your accolade systems, your score systems, just keep them all together so you can find them. The things that aren't so level dependent, things that are more like area specific, like obviously triggers have to be in a particular place. But if I had an accolade that related to that trigger specifically, I might put it next to the trigger so that you know that they're in the same area. So there's some logic there to how things are laid out. So the accolade is something that awards experience. So we're going to add to this name, we're going to say fish stick died. And this is what's going to prompt on the HUD when something happens. So when fish sticks dies, we're going to award a small amount of experience. It's possible to think that you can cheat the system because an experience is something that every player wants to collect. You could use UEFN to create a whole load of very large experience award systems in your accolade tool. Epic Games has got you there. They know that there is a way of using your own custom-built UEFN map just to walk between two triggers and keep creating large experience awards. It doesn't work that way. The reason it's very small, medium, large, very large is it manages it based on all your other activity. So you can't just award yourself a very large amount of XP. It'll be very large in relation to all the XP that you're gaining in this level. So think of it as very small to very large is your own level's worth of experience that you're awarding. Don't imagine it's in the context of the Battle Royale system. So I'm just going to specify small. We can, take this a bit further, like limit how many times you can receive that award, or make it specific to certain teams. Don't need to do that. And then we need to assign what happens. So we've got the same thing again, right? We got events. It's called a test award. While you're in the non-published version, it will always be a test award. It won't actually generate experience for you. It has to be published as a full UEFN map. But it's the same thing as before. We've got disable, award, and enable. Disable and enable are things that turn on and off the entire system. So it doesn't actually offer an award until you've clicked award. But enable needs to be if it's not enabled, it won't allow you to click the award either. So this is the equivalent of having it hidden or not hidden, but in its entirety, all the code will not work if it's been disabled. So you could disable the accolade system, or maybe you enable it at a certain point in the game, and then the award system will trigger. So think of it as turning it on and off, and then the award is the trigger that makes it happen. So we're going to go to award and add an element. Now, again, we want the trigger because it's saying, which device is going to make me trigger the award? Well, we want the trigger. And we're going to specify on triggered. Now, there's another way of doing this. I haven't actually checked to see if this will work, but I could take my NPC spawner and see what would happen if I trigger the accolade when the NPC was despawned. So I could say on eliminated, and that would also trigger an experience hit. So you could have it two different ways, because it could be that there's loads of different ways of triggering a despawn of fish stick. You could shoot him. You could have a trigger. You could have something else happening some other place. But every single time it's going to trigger the same experience. So you link that to him being despawned not the trigger itself. Just to keep things simple, I'm just going to put this back to trigger because I'm trying to demonstrate how the trigger works here. So I'm going to say on triggered, and that will create an experience award. Now I'm going to look at the end game device here. Now this is exactly the same. Activate and disable and enable. There is only really one thing you need to know here. I mean, you can set some of the conditions for the end game to happen, like what to end the game or end the round. You might have rounds playing like a battle, like a capture the flag, where you take it in turns, and what the call outs are. But essentially, this thing does one thing. This is the equivalent of the quit game command. You need to have enabled here. Sorry, you need to have activate in order for it to trigger an end game. Otherwise, the game will keep running forever and ever and ever until everyone's quit. So we need to create an activation for that as well. So we're going to do trigger and on triggered. Now, what this will do in reality, so now when we step on this trigger, it is triggering three things. And we can see this by clicking on it, and it will show us down here the three things that we have assigned to it from elsewhere. It's linked, so it knows. We've got the NPC spawner. It will trigger a despawn of fish sticks on the NPC spawner. It will trigger an award on the accolade system, and it will trigger an activation of the endgame device. So these are the three things that are going to happen when that trigger is activated. Now, in reality, I don't want the endgame device to go straight away, because that will, you'll see the experience come in at exactly the same time as fish stick dies, at exactly the same time as the endgame screen comes. So I'm going to change this. I'm going to remove the trigger and use a different system. This time I'm going to use a timer. Now, a timer device can be used loads of different ways. You can see it, you can hide it, you can set it for countdowns or count up. I'm going to set this for 20 seconds, and it's going to count down, and it's going to start at the game starts. As soon as the game launches, it starts. And I'm going to leave it visible so we can see what the time is. Timer name, we're going to call it game end. And so what I want this to do is at the end of the 20-second countdown, it's going to trigger the end game device. So can it be interacted with? Yes, because we want it to be able to interact with the end game system. Loads of different things that you can add in here. You can start to play with it. Persistence is a whole other thing I'm not going to go into at all in these lessons, but that's a way for, if a countdown happens and you leave a session at 5 seconds to the end and you come back into it, it will continue to count down from 5. It remembers that you were at 5 seconds. But the only thing I'm really interested in here is all of these user events and controls. So these are the functions. We've got start, complete, reset, pause. So if you wanted to trigger this to start, we could do it when the trigger goes. So what I'm going to say, start the timer when the trigger is triggered, and that will start counting down from then. And I'm just going to leave the rest of this. So there's loads of other things you can do. You can tell it to restart or stop or pause, all with different controls. You can have buttons that do that. And then what is going to be done on success, on failure, on start urgency mode. So we need to tell something that it needs to be listening to the timer. Now, if you think about this has always been the other way around to what is logical. You need to go to the device that has to have the interaction called to it first. So we're going to go to the end game device, and there we're going to specify the timer. So we're going to hit activate, specify the timer device, and we're going to say on success. So that means that when the timer is completed, it calls success, and it's going to trigger the end game device. So let's just recap what's happened there, okay? The trigger, and if we go down here, we can see, is set to tell the timer device to start. The timer device is set to 20 seconds. I might change that to 10 seconds just to make the debugging quicker. So the countdown will happen for 10 seconds once the trigger's been activated. So the trigger's going to do three things. It's going to tell fish sticks to despawn. It's going to trigger an accolade, which is going to grant experience, and start the countdown from 10 seconds. At the end of the countdown, if I come down to here, on success, is going to trigger the end game device, activate the end game device, and that is going to create a victory call out. So let's save this. I've got 3 unsaved. I'm going to hit save selected, save, and then I'm going to push my changes, and then I will pause it while I wait for it to update on my Fortnite version. Okay, and it's saying that it's finished uploading, so let's jump over here. It's still pushing. Hang on, start game. So it's still in edit mode, and then now the game's running. So the countdown started automatically. That's not right, that shouldn't have happened. So we're gonna do this. Triggered a small XP award, and at the end of the 10 seconds, it has set us to the end game, which takes us back to the edit mode. So let's go back and just have a look, work out what went wrong with the timer, because that shouldn't have started straight away. And it's because I've got start at game start selected. So it started in spite of the trigger being needed. So I'm going to click that off, push the changes again, or I have to save again. And frustratingly, I have to wait another 5 minutes for it to upload just to test this one thing. I think it's about to finish. I'm going to go into it. I realise now why it was in edit mode last time. It's because it already run the whole 10 seconds of that game and taken us back to the edit mode. It ended the game before I had a chance to load it. But hopefully it should now be running. And now you'll notice that it says current memory usage is at 3,324 of 100,000. That we've got nothing in the level at the moment, so that is using a little bit of data. It's nowhere near as much as if we brought in our own content. Obviously, if you used every single asset that Fortnite owns, it would eventually run out. But that is why it's not based on megabytes and gigabytes, is because it actually looks at the proportion of the processing power that it requires. So there we go. I no longer have the countdown going. Fish Sticks has arrived. I'm sorry, Fish Sticks. We've been killing you a lot this morning. So we're going to step on the trigger. It despawns. We got a notification Fish Sticks died. We got the small XP and the countdown started. And when it gets to 0, the endgame device will be triggered. And there we go. So that is how you use the devices. Now, there's obviously loads in there, and they can do all sorts of clever things. You can see that with things like the NPC spawner, that there's options for pausing, starting, playing, triggering, despawning. There's every type of interaction possible. You can get really nested in this. I suggest that you draw it out as a bit of a flow chart, figure out what it is that you need to connect to what, and work backwards. So your end game device needs to connect to your timer. So you work down the line, because that's the direction that all of the interactions have to be built into the devices. If you go the other way, you go trigger needs to trigger the timer. Well, now I need to build the timer, and then you go into the timer and tell it to talk to the trigger. So work backwards at least in the way you connect up your devices to make sure that flow makes sense. In the next lesson, we're going to look at how to import assets. Be very brief, but there's a couple of key gotchas I just want to cover.